First is Gary Ferris. He's the author of a book called Presidential Places, and it's a fascinating book. It looks at the different sites relating to U.S. presidents, from their birthplaces through where they went to school, where they got married, and where their presidential libraries are. Gary Ferris joins us by phone now. Hi, Gary. Welcome to WHO.
Hi, Steve. Thanks. It's nice to be with you today.
Now, your background is not one of, you're not a history professor. You're not necessarily a historian. What do you do for a living?
No, well, I work for the American Red Cross. I do our planned giving program, so I deal with many of the volunteers and donors who are seniors and interested in including the Red Cross in their estate plans. And I think I've just been interested in history all my life, and came across this project a few years ago when my wife and I were living in Albany. We went to Boston for a weekend trip, and we were at the Kennedy birthplace, and we're talking with a park ranger there. We were told that many families like to come through on a mission, if you will, to visit as many presidential sites as possible. We thought that would be a great thing to do. We couldn't find a book that listed all of them, so we wrote one.
Now, we assume that every president probably has one or two presidential sites. For example, they would all have an official library, official birthplace, but there's many more sites than that.
Oh, that's right. What I tried to do was, with this book, and I go president by president, I try to basically follow their footsteps, where they were born, where they went to school, where they worked, where they became interested in politics, of course, important places during their presidential careers, and what they did after the presidency. And then, of course, finally, the circumstances of their deaths and where their funerals were held and where they're remembered, where they're buried.
In a few minutes, we're going to open up the phone lines, and we're going to give some of our listeners a presidential quiz to find out how much they know about presidents who've lived in the last 50 years, so if listeners can stay tuned for that on WHO Radio. But, Gary, tell me about the idea that these are very often privately run operations, right? These are not necessarily run by the National Park Service.
That's right. In fact, one of the things that surprised me incredibly that day when we were at the Kennedy birthplace was that I bought a copy of the National Park Service. They call it a pass book. It's a wonderful little book. And I thought it would have all the presidential sites in it, but I was really surprised to find that the Park Service only maintains about 30 or 35 presidential sites. These can be homes. Of course, the Archive Administration is responsible for the libraries. But there are very few presidential sites, and what I found in doing research is that some of the presidents are well remembered, and there are a lot of sites, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, for example, and many of their sites are owned by different organizations. For instance, Mount Vernon is owned by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, has been for a long time, and another example, I'm thinking of Woodrow Wilson. He was, before he was president, he was living in New Jersey. He was president of Princeton University. Actually, it's before he even became elected governor. His home still stands, but it's a private residence, so it's not the kind of place where somebody would go and visit. But, of course, I didn't include all the places where the presidents traveled.
Right.
I think that would be too much to put in a book. But
well, for example, with Reagan, he lived in a number of different homes, and you kind of summarized it down into the one that he particularly writes about in his autobiography.
That's right. And interesting about that home in Illinois, where he lived, his family rented a few homes in the area when he was a young man. But the one home that's open now as a boyhood home museum in Dixon, I believe, was up for sale during the Reagan administration, and a local postal carrier was walking by, and he noticed the for sale sign, and the home had been cut up into an apartment, multi-family apartment building. So he went and immediately put down a deposit on it and raised money to buy the home and turn it into a museum for the president. And coincidentally, he was able to do all that and have the place officially opened on President Reagan's 80th birthday. And the president was there on the opening day. Of course, the house was empty at the time. And they've worked for a long time to gather furnishings so that they could furnish the home so that it would be to the period. And that's, I guess, a fine example of a wonderful presidential site that is privately owned and operated.
Gary Ferris is with us, the author of Presidential Places. And, Gary, I was fascinated to see how many recent presidents were raised by someone other than their two parents, or they maybe lived in a grandparent's home.
That's right.
I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, there were a number of them. And, of course, you think of the president, you think of somebody, having grown up in what we call an intact family their whole life. But in many instances, that wasn't the case, and many of the presidents, as young men, were rabble-rousers themselves. So they got into various kinds of trouble, and but they're all people. And two of them in particular were raised by step-parents, and one of them I like to joke with people, like to ask the question, who was a king before becoming president?
Don't give him a clue, because we're going to ask this for a question in a minute.
Okay, well, I'm not going to elaborate.
Don't tell him. But a couple of presidents have different birth names.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of those.
And we'll find out those in just a minute.
That's right.
And we're going to open up the phone lines now at 284-1040, or the INS toll-free line is 800-469-4295. We're going to do the presidential trivia quiz and ask you, we're going to give you multiple choice, so you're not going to embarrass yourself too much. And then we're going to give away copies of Presidential Places. Two of the people who call in and get the answer correctly will be awarded copies at the end of the show today, so stay tuned throughout this morning on News Radio 1040 WHO. Of course, Herbert Hoover is very close to our heart here in Iowa.
Sure.
His birthplace here. What are some of the interesting details that we may not know about him that you discovered by researching his background?
Well, Hoover was a really interesting person, of course, and one of the things that I found amazing about his background was that, tragically, he became an orphan as a young man, and his father died, I believe, when he was 7 or 8 years old, and his mother died a few years after that. So he was sent to live with relatives and had a really hard upbringing. In fact, when he went to college at Stanford University, his nickname on campus was the orphan kid from Iowa. But, of course, he grew to be a great leader. But he was a really interesting man that at times was aloof and really not comfortable being with large groups of people, and particularly uncomfortable with criticism. So I think that had a lot to do with his relationship with Congress. He found it very uncomfortable to deal with Congress.
His degree was in geology.
That's right.
What in the world? What did he do with his geology degree?
Well, he put it to use sometime after. I think his goal was to become an engineer, and I believe that he had worked on that early in his career, but then when World War I broke out, he was in England at the time, and I think he became fascinated with politics and spent a great deal of his time, of course, gathering information about the war, and eventually that led to the formation of the institute at Stanford University bearing his name.
Gary Ferris is with us. He's the author of Presidential Places, and we're going to go to the phone lines because, Gary, as you can imagine, folks think they know a lot about presidents.
Right.
And what we're going to do is use these questions as springboards to finding out some interesting tidbits from the book Presidential Places. And let's start with Janine. Hi, Janine. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks.
Janine, you're going to get that first question that Gary alluded to.
I hope it's one I know.
Well, I'm going to give you multiple choice, so it won't be too bad.
Okay.
Who was the president who was born Leslie Lynch King Jr.? This is in the last 50 years. Leslie Lynch King Jr.
Was it Gerald Ford?
It was Ford. You didn't even need a multiple choice.
That's right.
Gary, tell us about that.
Well, that's right. He was born Leslie Lynch King Jr., and his parents divorced not long after his birth. She eventually got married to a gentleman named Ford, who adopted the future president. And at that point, they legally changed his name to Gerald Randolph Ford, Jr.
I mean, Leslie Lynch King isn't anything like Gerald Randolph Ford.
No, that's right. Not at all. And but it's interesting. He, of course, changed his entire name. We had one other president, of course, who, under a similar circumstance, was adopted and just changed his last name. But
let's go ahead and talk about him.
Oh, that's William Clinton.
Clinton was born what?
He was born William Jefferson Blythe.
Blythe,
B-L-Y-T-H-E.
And he changed it when he was a teenager, didn't he?
That's right. His mother remarried, and he was legally adopted by his stepfather, whose name was Clinton, and so of course he assumed that last name.
That's fascinating. Janine, thanks for tuning in, and Janie, you're up next on Winzenburg on the Weekend. Hi, Janie.
Hi.
Janie, who is a lifeguard who saved 77 lives? This is a president who started out as a lifeguard who saved 77 lives. Was it Clinton, Reagan, or Kennedy?
Kennedy.
Well, that's what I would guess, but I kind of tossed that in there because we were all familiar with Kennedy being out there on the beach like at Cape Cod. But, Gary, it's actually Reagan.
That's Ronald Reagan, that's right. And he was a really interesting man when he was growing up. He became a lifeguard when he was living in Dixon, Illinois, and spent a great deal of his time as a lifeguard at a community swimming area, which was in Lowell Park. It was a pond or river. And he had a log, and every time he would save a life, he was reported to have put a notch on that log. Well, one day a storm came and washed the log away, and the people of Dixon got together and created a plaque, which is now in the Loveland Community Center in Dixon. But at the time the log washed away, it was said to have 77 notches in it. So I don't know if anybody can document all 77 lives that he saved.
But it's a lot.
But of course, my being somebody with Red Cross, that struck me as a really interesting fact because we train people to do that.
Thanks, Janie, for listening to WHO Radio. Is it Dixie? Dixie, are you up next here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Dixie. Who never owned a home until he was 60 years old? Which president never owned a home until he was 60 years old? Was it Truman, Eisenhower, or Carter?
I'm going to say
Truman?
Truman.
No. Eisenhower it was because sure he was in the military.
Oh, I was going to say that.
So he never owned a home. Right. Thanks, Dixie.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting, Gary. We assume these guys, most of them who go into politics these days tend to have money and
That's right.
are well established. But here Eisenhower, was with the military and didn't have a home. And he only owned one home in his whole lifetime.
Only one home. That's exactly right. And, interesting about Eisenhower, of course, he was a career soldier. And when he was first suggested as a candidate for president, he didn't even belong to a political party. He felt that a soldier's role was to defend the country, not to take sides in politics. And because of that, he never joined a political party.
Right.
And, of course, there was a lot of, lobbying or debate or whatever back and forth between both parties to get him to affiliate. And eventually, of course, he affiliated with the Republican Party. But that's right. It wasn't until he was in his 60s that he bought the home in Gettysburg.
Yeah, we're doing a presidential trivia quiz with some of our listeners. Gary, let's get back to the phone lines. And Becky, you're up next on WHO. Hi, Becky.
Good morning.
Who was the first president born in a hospital? Was it Kennedy, Carter, or Clinton? First president born in a hospital. Kennedy, Carter, or Clinton?
I'd say probably Kennedy.
Nope. Gary, who was it?
Well, it was Jimmy Carter.
That's hard to believe.
That's right. October 1st, 1924. He was born in a building that at the time was Wise Hospital in Plains, Georgia. And it's no longer operating as a hospital. It since has been turned into a nursing home, and coincidentally, it's named in honor of the president's mother, who was a nurse.
Wow.
That's the Lillian G. Carter Nursing Center.
Thanks for listening, Becky. Let's head to Heather. Hi, Heather. Thanks for waiting. Heather, you ready for your question?
Yeah.
Okay, Heather, how old are you?
9.
Okay. Let's see. I better give Heather one that's a little bit easier.
There we go.
I'll have to have her guess at this one. Heather, where do you think President Eisenhower was born? President Eisenhower. This was before your time, but your parents would remember President Eisenhower. Was it in Kansas, Maryland, or Texas?
Texas.
You got it right, Heather.
That's great. Have you been studying history of our presidents, Heather?
Yeah, we have, but I haven't got to do him.
Ah.
Well, Gary, with Eisenhower, a lot of people think it's Kansas.
Yeah, that's right, because of Abilene, of course. But he actually was born in Denison, Texas, and that was in 1890. And his family, I believe, didn't live there all that long. They moved to Abilene,
That's
Kansas,
right.
When he was just a young guy.
Gee, Heather, you're smarter than some of these adults who are calling in.
Heather, maybe one day you'll become president.
That's great. The book Presidential Places, it's by Gary Ferris, and we're listening to News Radio 1040 WHO, headed back to the phone lines. And Barry, you're up next. Hi, Barry.
Hi.
Phone lines are going crazy here. People want to get part of this presidential trivia quiz.
That's great.
And Barry, who is called Rat Face in high school? Which president was called Rat Face in high school? Was it Nixon, Kennedy, or Clinton?
Nixon.
I threw that in because I thought maybe you'd guess that, but it's actually Kennedy.
That's an amazing thing to think. We remember President Kennedy as one of our most dapper, handsome presidents that we had, and of course during school, one of his nicknames was Rat Face.
Isn't that something? Thanks, Barry, for listening to WHO Radio. Jonathan, you're up next on Winzenburg on the Weekend. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Who was the president who met his wife when he played the lead in the production of a play called The Dark Tower? Who was the president who met his wife when he played the lead in the production of a play called The Dark Tower? Was it Clinton, Reagan, or Nixon?
Reagan.
Nope, that's the good guess because he was an actor. but in reality it was Nixon.
That's right.
And Gary, I guess Nixon's acting ability served him a little later in life.
Well, that it did. Yeah, he was a really interesting character. In fact, he was told that a young lady named Pat Ryan, her real name was Thelma, had come to town, and that she was going to be in the local theater group's production of The Dark Tower. So he trotted on down to get in the part, or to get in the program. Of course, he wound up playing the male role, and he met her and told his friends when he met her that he had just fallen in love with somebody that he eventually would marry, and of course he did.
Now, I knew he played piano, but I hadn't realized he was an actor as well.
Right. I'd be really interesting to be able to see something that that he did. He had a nickname when he was in school as well, in graduate school.
And it wasn't Ratface.
No, it wasn't Ratface. They called him Gloomy Gus.
Thanks for listening, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And next we've got Barbara. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Okay, Barbara, here's your question. Who is the last president not inaugurated at the Capitol steps in Washington, D.C.? You know, usually the president's inaugurated there at the Capitol in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Who is the last president who was not inaugurated at the Capitol? Was it Ford, Johnson, or Kennedy?
Johnson.
No, if you took a minute and thought about it, it was Ford because Nixon resigned, and so Ford had to be sworn into office quickly at the White House.
That's right.
Oh.
Yeah, that was...
I thought it was Johnson on
Because
the
of
airplane.
Kennedy. I know what you're saying, but,
Yep.
but there was one more recent than that, and that was Ford.
We have that
Thanks
great,
for trying, Barbara.
We have that great image of Johnson taking the oath of office on the plane. But of course, just moments after that other very memorable image of Nixon getting on the helicopter, putting up his arms as he usually did. That was August 9th of 1974. Right. Just a few moments after that, Gerald Ford took the oath of office in the East Room.
Talking with Gary Ferris, the author of Presidential Places. We're going to take more of your calls on Winzenburg on the Weekend, News Radio 1040, WHO. And Evelyn, you're up next. Hi, Evelyn.
Yes.
Okay, Evelyn, who was offered a contract with the Green Bay Packers? Which president was offered a contract with the Green Bay Packers? Was it Nixon, Clinton, or Ford?
I'm guessing Ford.
Good job.
All right.
He actually got a couple of offers, didn't he, Gary?
He did. In fact, I've got to tell you a rather interesting thing about President Ford. He was an incredible athlete, of course. Played in the Shrine East-West game and had an offer to play with the Chicago Bears and with the Packers. But interesting thing happened when I was doing the research for the book. I took the draft sections of each of the presidents, the living ex-presidents, and LBJ, of course, and I sent those to the ex-presidents, and in the case of LBJ, I sent that to Lady Bird, and I asked them if they would mind making any corrections, revisions, additions, that kind of thing.
Wow. And
I heard back from all of them, with the exception of the Clintons were a little too busy, obviously, and the Reagans, because of the unauthorized biography, they nicely sent back a letter, said that they don't get involved with any other book project. But and most of the others, I got letters from administrative assistants saying, you know, here's what the president suggests you do with your text. But with the section from Gerald Ford, the letter that I got back was really brief, just 2 sentences. You know, thank you very much, and here are some suggested revisions. Attached to it were the 7 or 8 pages of computer-generated type that I had sent out initially, with some corrections written in pencil.
Oh my
by
gosh!
Hand. And I looked, the signature on the cover letter from the administrative assistant was in pen, and it was sort of a flowing signature. And the pencil markings were, somebody was bearing down really hard writing. So I got out an encyclopedia to look at President Ford's signature, and it appears to me that President Ford made those changes himself. But then it occurred to me that he had to have done that because he left basically everything as I had written it, with the exception of his football career when he was at Michigan and then when he was offered contracts. He added a little extra foam on the beer, as you say, to the football parts of it. So
Ford still loves football, and that's probably still the highlight of his life, even though he was elected, not elected, but named president.
Well, I think that's the one thing that he probably, you're right, I guess nice way to put it, the high point of his life. But so I saved those pages.
I would save those, yes. Paula, you get the last question today. Okay, Paula?
Yeah?
How old are you?
10.
All right, Paula, we want another winner here. So, who was born in Omaha but only lived there a short time as a baby and then moved to Michigan? Which president was born in Omaha but just lived there a short time and then moved to Michigan? Was it Reagan, Ford, or Truman?
Ford?
Good job.
That's right.
And I was surprised by that, Gary. Here we are, only 2 hours drive from Omaha, and I didn't know that.
That's right. Well, he lived there for a very short period of time. As I had mentioned earlier, his parents divorced. Gerald Ford was born in 1913, and it was 1916 when his family, when his mother and he moved back to Michigan. The home they lived in was destroyed by fire back in the early 70s and was finally knocked down. And it wasn't until 1974 that a local businessman named James Paxson purchased the property and constructed an absolutely beautiful site, the Gerald Ford Birth Site and Gardens. And then he subsequently bought the adjacent property and built the Gerald Ford Conservation Center.
Thanks,
so it's a
Paula.
wonderful monument to a wonderful man.
Gary, it's a good book for folks to use who want to do what you started out doing, which is basically visiting presidential historic sites.
That's correct. And what I wanted to do was create a book that would become, I think, more than just a tour guide. I wanted it to become a family keepsake. So I included next to each listing a gray-shaded box with the name of the site in the box, and that's a place where people can either use the National Park Service stamp and stamp in the date that they visited, or make notes in the book as they go along. And we have about 350 sites in there, and we have one copy that my family uses as we travel around, and our goal is to fill up as many of these boxes as we can.
Do you have advice for travelers this summer on the best places to visit?
Well, I think the best place, I think, is anywhere you go with your family and you have a good time. Of course, the sites are spread out all over the country, but the one thing that I find really interesting is in my travels, after spending some time at the sites related to presidents, you come away with a different understanding of these men and what they did. For instance, James Buchanan is not known for being a great leader. Of course, the country fell apart during his presidency, but he really was an incredible diplomat, and that comes through very clearly if you visit his home and you learn a little bit more about him as a person.
But one thing I wanted to ask you is, since some of these are privately done, don't they always make the presidents look good? Do they ever include some of the dirt?
Well, of course they all want the president to appear good, but, they all have their own dirty laundry. You look at somebody like Warren Harding. I think he was known as the philanderer's philanderer. He even makes President Clinton, I think, appear to be a church mouse. But of course, he's remembered in a very kind way, and I think a lot of that has to do with time as well. Time tends to be kind to people. We try to stress the good points and remember the good.
It's a great book for travelers. It's called Presidential Places, A Guide to the Historic Sites of U.S. Presidents by Gary Ferris. Thanks for taking the time this weekend to be with us.